Welcome back into another edition of HeadCoachU. I'm Bryan Fischer of D1 Ticker. Thrilled to welcome in Bronco Mendenhall, the former BYU and Virginia coach once again. Bronco, how are you?
I'm great, Bryan. Good to see you.
It sounds like it was a busy weekend for you, but not because you're sitting down watching some crazy college football ending. You're moving again. I would imagine that process as a coach you're almost kind of familiar with at this point.
I've been really lucky being at BYU for 13 years and then Virginia for 6. I haven't had the typical, at least at the head coach position, I haven't had the typical movement there. But as an assistant, there's lots of moves and lots of stops as you just kind of find your way and work your way up. In this particular case, mission is almost accomplished. One of our designs, my wife and I, for pausing from coaching this year was to set up our infrastructure for kind of the assault camp on launching chapter 2 of our career. And that's headquartered here in Montana. So we actually get to move into our home today. Our ranch, at least to have basic infrastructure and get up and functioning, is about a month away. And so really by the time November hits, that'll be one of the main reasons that we stopped, is to get all this set up for kids and grandkids and a place for the summer, but also just be together. So we're getting close and yeah, moving in today, which we're really excited about.
Well, as stressful as moving might be, you also have the kind of ranching component you got to worry about up there as well. Do you get up earlier doing that than you did being a coach?
It's similar, different type of work. One is getting up at Virginia, especially the academic rigor there was amazing and challenging, but also awesome. And wanting our players to maximize every class they could take and every sequence of class they could take in order. We practiced really early to get ahead of all that. So we truly could have right? They could play amazing football and have a super experience, but then they wouldn't be limited in any way because of football in terms of the access to the magical education that was there. So early get-ups there, but it was team meetings and right onto the practice field. And here it starts with feeding and cleaning stalls and the things that really, but similar, taking care of others before yourself. Just, in this case, it's just horses rather than players.
Well, I'm totally getting off topic here, but I'm kind of curious about that move, to early morning practices. It seems like that's a fairly recent trend for a lot of head coaches. I remember, when I first started out covering beats, it was always kind of the late afternoon practice after kids got out of class. But it seems like not only is there that focus on academics and allowing them to go to class, the rest of the day. It seems like that has been the preference of coaches more and more to just get that morning practice and get it out of the way.
I think for each coach it's different. It started for me at Brigham Young University. There are so many married players, between 30 and 40 per year is kind of where we were in my tenure. And when you consider the classes, and then some of those players, right, they have children and their wives are working and they're both trying to make ends meet, and the possible conflicts that could come up later in the afternoon or evenings, it just seemed like something that wasn't ideal for that institution, right? The kids that were attending there, and to give them their best chance to do it all, because they're right. It wasn't just football and it wasn't just school. You add the faith-based element, but then you add the marital component. And so really it just made a lot more sense to move the football at the very, very, very beginning and get that work done. And so kind of the merger of all other priorities in their lives could come together in a way that they wanted it to happen, rather than football kind of being inserted right in the middle of all that. And so it started for me at BYU, which I really liked. And then I read a great book called Spark, and Spark has done some amazing research, or within the book, there's some amazing research on the benefits of exercise on learning. And I started to be captivated by, well, wait a second, maybe by your heart rate being elevated, there's proof that then you're more ready for the learning environment. And that book goes on to document just that. So I felt then, and our programs have always done really, really well academically. I can't say that that's the only reason, but I think it contributed. Where the day was started, there was a heightened sense of arousal and readiness for the day, but also for learning. And so that book, if anyone hasn't read it, it's worth the read if you're considering in your own day or even an organization starting early to prepare for learning. The name of it's Spark, but that's how it started. And at Virginia, the afternoons weren't quite the same with marital or those kind of challenges, but the academic rigor, but also just the access. I certainly didn't want football to be the reason that some of the classes couldn't be taken when there's so much to be value added there. So it just seemed to fit much better for all things, which is what I'm interested in, right? The complete development of a young person. And I think that in the book by Jim Collins, it's called Good to Great. He called it the tyranny of or. And a lot of us, we make trade-offs. We're going to pick this or that. Many times it doesn't need to get down to that. There's a beauty of and. If you really architect your day and your organization and plan, now it's extra work and it's harder. However, it's way more rewarding. And I'll put it this way. I'm going to just kind of segue. I don't know many of my peers, and I've worked with so many great people in the head coaching world that were retained because of their graduation rate, or retained because of the number of community service hours, or retained because of the foundation of giving back that they presented to a community, if they didn't win. Right. So the bottom line as a leader is you have to drive great results on the field. Right. That has to happen. It's then how much of your own time are you willing to put into other things that you really think will add value, knowing that compensation won't be part of that, but just internal kind of morality and decency, but really caring about other people and making sure they can have a great experience. And so anyway, back to this idea of early morning practice, it was that idea of and. There's no reason football has to be in place of academic progression. There's no reason football has to be in place of a husband and wife and managing daycare, when they're college students and no money. So it was just the idea of how do we do all of this? And I like that idea.
Oh, believe me, I certainly understand the daycare standpoint as well with two little ones here at home. But it's been a week filled with a lot of stories around college football. One of them has been kind of in relation to you. I just wanted to kind of get it out of the way, get the elephant out of the room. A lot of discussion now that the Nebraska job has opened up. Arizona State recently came open with Herm Edwards deciding to part ways with that program. Your name has been mentioned, quite a few times by pundits and analysts and people with all these lists. And I'm just kind of curious how you kind of react to that and hearing your name connected to those openings.
Number one, it's flattering, and I'm certainly appreciative, but also it's part of the business, right? The tough part about being a head football coach is you're under constant scrutiny, and there's huge expectations, especially at a place like Nebraska, Arizona State, or really anywhere. Those things are real, and it's more of a trend now when early seasons don't go exactly as planned, especially if there's any kind of maybe residue from a previous season or a tenure that doesn't seem where momentum is being generated. The level of patience now really diminishes pretty early. And so here we are week 3 or week 4, and coaching changes have happened. My wife and I paused intentionally after 17 years, not to walk away and not to retire, but to rethink, reframe, and then reassault, I guess if that's even a word, our entry and re-entry back into college football. We haven't found anything in this time period as opportunities have come to impact young people that's greater than the world of college athletics. We were wondering, is there something? We were looking, could there be anything that rivaled that? And the answer for us, my wife and I, is no, there isn't. And so it's flattering to be mentioned. I think there's all kinds of documentation on the history of, I love taking programs that haven't had success or recent success and recaptivating, re-energizing, and rebuilding and having them become constant winners while amazing people are being built and academics are thriving and community engagement is high and there's championships won. I like all of that. And possibly that's why my name is being mentioned, but Holly and I are looking to re-enter. We're excited for that opportunity. Certainly there would be interest at Nebraska, at Arizona State. The main point would be, though, any place that really wants to develop amazing young people through championship football, right? We want both of those things. And that's where our passion and my passion lies. And there's probably not another college head football coach that's more energized now after riding horses almost every day, building properties in Montana, training for triathlons, and just regrouping with a clear mind, fresher perspective. Because I know what the job takes, and it's very difficult to sustain. I didn't even know the rest of the world existed during the fall, which is what I'm seeing now, which has just made football that much more special to me. So lots of learnings, but lots of excitement. My wife and I are super encouraged. Where and how we'll end up, we'll see. but we are clear developing young people through amazing football is what we want to do. And that's been a great gift that we've learned over this past 8 months-ish.
I mean, we've talked about a little bit on this podcast in terms of what you were looking for in a program to take over going forward, and a lot of that is a bit of a rebuilding challenges. Both those places would qualify at this point, given what they're going through or about to go through in the case of Arizona State with some NCAA investigations kind of hovering around that program. But in terms of like the actual like inherent qualities of a program that you're going to look at and consider, is there kind of one thing overriding beyond anything else?
Oh, yeah. And I appreciate the question. It's purpose and intent. Let's just face it, Brian, the game is moving very quickly, right? We're actually talking about a game that's played against the backdrop of higher education. The number of times you hear higher education mentioned in any discussion at any time right now in college football, you might have to flip the page over and look at the very bottom to see the notes, but you don't hear it, the money associated with possibly alcohol sales at the stadium, possibly conference realignment because of a TV deal, the NIL, which is where can the dollars come from at a higher level than where people currently are, and what are they willing to do to chase those things? I like the idea of a construct of, and again, make no mistake, winning is not the expendable part of this, right? It's essential for that to happen no matter where you're coaching. And there's nothing more fun than having success on the football field and seeing your team happy. I'm looking for places that absolutely and fiercely want that, almost to where they can't breathe without it or sleep without the success. One of the things I always used to share with my team, this isn't just what you do, it's how you do it. I want an institution that certainly we want to compete at the highest level against anyone, anywhere, at any time, quite frankly, and are looking forward to taking on that challenge and won't back down from anyone, with young people that are probably studying like crazy on the plane flight over, right? Have great family relations, possibly with this new NIL focus, what they're willing to give back to the community and how can they leave a lasting impact, not just what they can get from, I'll make something up, a shoe deal or an advertisement, but what can they then say, this institution and this community's better because I was here. I'm looking for a place that wants all of that. And that to me is fulfilling. And make no mistake, Brian, it's way harder to do that. And many coaches, quite frankly, it's not that they don't see the value in it, but where's the time to do that? I'm just not fulfilled without that part also. And so I'd love an institution that wants great football and wants championships at the very highest level and wants to fund and resource and help kids become within that arena, but also not at the expense of who they're becoming and what they can give back. And so I think, purpose and intent have a lot to do with it.
Well, I want to dive into that NIL topic in just a little bit, but first and foremost, your last trip. Speaking of Nebraska, the last time you were there, a pretty famous Hail Mary that you guys had to get the win there against the Cornhuskers. I'm sure the fan base certainly remembers that on both sides of the coin when you were with BYU. But late game clock management has been a bit of an issue. Kind of popped up again in college football. We had a number of Hail Marys this past weekend. The NFL, a few clock issues for some head coaches. I'm just kind of curious how you approach that and how you might practice kind of that situational football at the end to get your guys prepared for some of those situations where, the clock is ticking down and you got to score, and it can be a lot. And we see a lot of mistakes recently. We saw that this weekend. How do you kind of approach that and make sure your team is prepared for those kind of 2-minute drills?
I love the question. Much like anything in life or in our organizations, practice is very relevant, but the specificity of practice and how deliberate the practice is and the context it's in are essential. And a lot of times coaches will easily rationalize, well, how many times, and I'll just use short yardage or goal line defense how many goal line defenses will we call? So they go back for 15 years and say, well, that's about 1% of all plays are going to be a goal line defensive play. So how much time do we put in on it at practice? Justifying, man, there's other things we could be doing. That sounds logical until you need a goal line stand to win a game.
Yeah.
The same thing would be with Hail Mary defense or offense. If you look at the number of snaps not as relevant. If you look at the contextual implications of the snaps, it makes you want to practice it almost first every day once you've gone through either a victory or a loss that way. So there's the contextual, intentional, deliberate component of practicing it and those decisions, but also then there's the game day structure and process. And I'll frame it just this way. I love analytics, and we are very, well, I would say pioneer oriented. Matt Edwards ran that department for us at the University of Virginia. And then we had super bright students at Virginia that were in the engineering and analytics departments that were, man, we had every intern available, almost our own little sub factory of analytics. And we had a book literally on game day based on any given opponent that would tell me regardless of score. So it would give me the exact score with the exact time on the clock within the exact quarter and field position. And I'd be saying, what do the numbers say? And it could give me the tendencies of whether to go for it on fourth down. I would have the numbers coming in real time, just in a kind of a matter of fact, no drama way, almost just like there's a recording, right? And so I could always be framing a play in context to not only that game, but what does the history show of that opponent, of that staff, right? And what they did and when, and then what are our percentages of winning if this fourth down conversion is either gone for or not, et cetera. And so that was happening all the time. So literally when we got about to the 40-yard line, even before we've crossed the 50, I'd start asking, what do the numbers say in relation to the clock, in relation to the score, in relation to the field position? So that had already started. Now, if you go to the end of the game, it was the exact same process where I had the analytics already dialed in for that opponent. But then we'd have a process owner. So our quarterback coach, his name was Jason Beck. And Jason has no emotion. Literally, he's blue-green if you looked at the brain dominance. And so factual, analytical, sequential, with a heart rate that I'm not sure ever has gone past like 45, no matter how wild the circumstance. And so going back to Nebraska, so he's the owner of all of our timeouts within 2 minutes, and then talking to me while analytics are talking to me at the same time. They're taking turns, but that way I'm forming a perfect construct of what does this really mean from the tactical, right, and the timeout orientation, as well as the implications of any play we run, and then the usage not only of the timeout, but again of how aggressive or non-aggressive do we need to be against that particular opponent. So anyway, all that's happening in the headset, and you'll see the head coach, and you don't see any of that, but that's what's going on, at least in my headset, which was an amazing and really well-designed system. And then what will happen is that process owner, which in my case, the 2-minute owner, right? He's the one that's supposed to lose sleep over it all week long to make sure we get it right, to advise me, right? I still have to decide, but you want your advisor to be totally prepared. So my analytics advisor, black circles under his eyes, and because he's got young kids and he's got his job and he's doing the right? Same with my quarterback coach. That allowed me then to have all of that, and then I make the decision. If I made the decision, if I made a poor decision, it certainly wasn't because I was ill-informed. Sometimes intuition just kind of takes over, and I would hear on the headset, "Are you sure?" And no, but I think I am. And sometimes you just have to go with that. I'm okay with that, knowing, because everything else has been framed so clearly with the data, that if intuition and experience then says, "I don't think so," then the head coach has the right to pull away from that. What's not excusable, or what's some of the problems, is when you don't have the accurate information and the intuition is all you're going on. It's really easy to have emotion and intuition be prevalent only when you're in those situations. So anyway, each process needs an owner. Man, the more critical the process, the more distinct that ownership needs to be to the entire organization. I didn't want any other voices. My analytics, Matt Edwards and Jason Beck, no other voices on the headset, no nothing. Only those two. The 65,000 or 85 or 50 or 40, I couldn't control any of them and how noisy it was, but I could listen to who owned those processes to help me frame the decision. And I was framing the decision for my team, right? And there's nothing more fun to see happiness and smiles and celebration when it goes well. And we alluded to the Hail Mary against Nebraska, and I'll tell that story here in just a second. But that process for us, we spent hours and hours and hours, because you can play an entire game 3.5 hours long, right? Or low 3 hours-ish. And it can come down to, well, at one point, the NFL did a study, and I got my hands on it. Basically, 3 to 5 plays was determining outcome. in a typical NFL game, because parity is the ideal there. In college football, it's getting that way. I would say within conferences, especially, there's different levels of college football being deciphered. But anyway, 3 to 5 plays ultimately determines outcome in so many games. Those 3 to 5 plays are usually in the context of, right, a goal line stand, converting a 4th down, a Hail Mary, things that you wouldn't think you'd practice much, but the context and implications, they make you disproportionate. No, a head coach can then choose to practice those disproportionate to their volume because of impact. And I like doing that. Hopefully that made sense. That was a long answer.
No, that makes total sense. And the difficult part is you are dealing with kind of 18 to 24-year-olds who, as much as you might practice and kind of drill down, you got to get out of bounds, at this juncture. Sometimes they get tackled in bounds and you kind of got to adjust on the fly. And I'm curious how you make sure that you can listen to all that coming in and also kind of make those split-second decisions to go for it or kind of change course right there. That seems to be kind of the crux of some of the issues that we've seen with these late game management situations.
Yeah, I love that question because certainly as much as you plan, I don't remember a single game that ever went exactly as I thought it was going to go. And literally from the first play on, here's what you prepared for all week. And while the schemes and strategies might be similar, how the game progressed, rarely did it ever go according to plan. And so in those kind of micro segments you're talking about, and let's just talk about going out of bounds, hopefully our timeout usage has been great. And in those moments, right, before the team is back on the field, each position coach, with me as well to the entire group, saying, okay, this is our plan. Now it could be adjusted, but if, right, any ball is caught out of bounds is where we need to be as fast as possible. We're expecting to run 2 plays here and then a timeout. So we were trying to forecast for them as much as possible with key reminders. Then, right, we're looking at the quarterback. And we're looking at key other leaders for receivers. Again, process owners, right? The quarterback is owning the offense. A receiver is owning other receivers. Offensive lineman is owning other offensive linemen for the key reminders of, let's say it's a crucial, the clock is running out. It might be 3rd and 1. And we know the defense is going to possibly flinch to draw us off sides or something like that. But there's then sub-owners within that process on the field that are responsible for the critical reminders, and they're being trained during the week as well, but they're also being reminded in those scenarios. So to say, yeah, all 11 should know what to do, yep, I agree. To not have a sub-owner, right, as the additional reminder, kind of like the sergeant over each group, right, it made sense for us to do that. So at least you had another layer for those unexpected or when things went different where they could say, get out of bounds, or the quarterback would say, we got to clock it now because something just happened. And we're yelling from the sideline. He doesn't really have time to look and process as much without already having a great understanding of what the plan is. And so sometimes, as hard as this is going to sound, man, you're going to play exactly as your players are prepared. And they're going to play and they're going to perform exactly as you prepared them in those critical moments. And those process owners, like I'm saying, wow, does that help? And so it empowers them, much like special forces, right? In the military, they're looking to empower the really critical moments into the hands of the boots on the ground that are in the situation. So I'm going to stop just short of that, but that would be my ideal, right? Is when you could get players trained so well that in real time they could do that. And sometimes without a timeout or in unexpected circumstances, that would have to happen. So we tried to account for that as well. And hopefully you could kind of follow that train of thought.
As a defensive coach, is it as satisfying knocking that down or getting an interception on those Hail Mary type of plays as it is possibly being on the other end and scoring on those type of plays to kind of walk it off?
Wow, it's relief is what it is. And right after the relief, then there's the celebration and gratification. But at first it's relief, and it reminds you literally of going into your neighborhood and playing an old game called 500. Where there'd be like 6 or 8 kids, and someone would be like 20 or 30 yards away, throwing the ball as high as they can, and you try to catch it or catch it off one bounce, and you get different points. This is just the stakes are so much higher, but that's really all it is. What makes you feel bad as a coach, and this happened to me, I think once in my career, we had a Hail Mary that was tipped around and an offensive player was on the ground on his back, and somehow it fell through all of that, literally onto his chest, and he's on the ground. and we don't win. And so then it went not only to players knocking the ball down in a backstop, but almost like someone being the vacuum cleaner as well. So you kind of add different parts sometimes by scenarios you couldn't even imagine, but then you better account for. And when you see one of those additional elements work that you plan for, now that's really gratifying. So again, the easy answer, relief. You're just so happy it got knocked down that an entire game can come down to something of a game of 500. But the execution of the design, that's what's so gratifying. And that's when the hugs are a little deeper because you felt like, as a coach, you feel like you had an influence on helping your team. They executed what you had practiced, but what you asked them to practice worked. And now that's a good feeling. Conversely, yeah, I've had schemes and designs where they did what I asked them to do and the design was faulty. And those are lonely moments. And the best way for those is just to take direct accountability. And it's hard, but necessary to look in your player's eyes and just say, it's totally my fault. I thought this would work. And you did exactly what you're supposed to do. And those are hard moments. They're overcomable, but I've had some of those too.
Well, we kind of saw both sides of those coins this past weekend. You know, there was a Cal against Notre Dame when they had a Hail Mary kind of bounced around and ended up landing right in the chest of somebody. They didn't end up catching it, so Notre Dame survived. And then, of course, the App State walk off, which was a wild scene there in Boone after everything that went in. That they ended up getting the victory over Troy. So both sides, we saw it in the NFL as well. Some crazy endings as well. So I think that's for coaches out there that are listening. I think a lot of what you just said, not only in terms of the analytics part, but how you kind of approach game management will be something that they can take to heart.
One of the things, if I could just summarize, the hardest decision, again, to kind of encapsulate what we just talked about, devoting practice time on areas within the plan or the game that by volume doesn't seem reasonable, but by implication demands it. And I've learned that lesson, and will be 2, 3, 4, 5 times to 1 those critical moment practices at the expense of some other things that really need to get done. Because can you imagine, and I've been on the Appalachian State side of those games, and I've also been on the Troy side, and those weeks are completely different. You're trying to help young people overcome as much as you can during the week, but can you imagine, and literally identities are shaped by the outcome of one play, almost at random, of a ball being thrown up, and seasons are being defined, right? And so anyway, that led to the practice structure that I've ended up doing because of that. And so I think in summary, I wasn't sure I hit that clear enough. Just wanted to go back and hit that.
No, absolutely, and I'm sure, speaking to that, the Troy head coach John Summerall this week probably using that as a bit of a motivation factor as well. Saying we can not only get back up and pick ourselves up, but we can kind of use this as motivation throughout the season. But the whole reason I wanted to talk with you this week was we had a little bit of news last week that Lead One, which is a kind of an association of athletic directors, kind of voted to have some discussions surrounding college football governance. And there's always been this kind of theory that maybe it needs to be split out away from the NCAA. And kind of broken off maybe under the college football playoff banner, maybe some other organization kind of responsible, I guess you could say, for kind of governing FBS football. And I'd be curious to kind of get your thoughts on that in terms of how you think the sport should be governed. I know you've worked with the FCA and a number of organizations about just kind of how to kind of shepherd the game along. But what are your kind of thoughts on how not only is the game governed right now, but how should it be governed in the future?
Yeah, there's a lot in there to unpack. I was a board member on the AFCA, which is the American Football Coaches Association, for a long time, going all the way back to early days at Brigham Young. So my whole tenure there and through Virginia. So most of my career, I've been privy to so many of these issues. And early on, Grant Taft was the president of the AFCA, and I went to him at one point, and this was 10 years easy. And I went to him and I said, I think these meetings would be much more efficient if they were divisional. So here's the NAIA coaches that have a meeting similar to this, because all the board members would be together and we're talking about issues inherent to all of college football. And then Division II, I was suggesting should meet together, and the FCS would meet together. The Group of Five would meet together, and Power Five would meet together. Even within Power Five now, there are some differences, but I was thinking the relevancy of the governance and the management even then seemed to be so much, there was a lot of disparity, and the issues were not the same issues. And so I saw it back then. And so to your point now, certainly there's intrigue about breaking off, but breaking off where and to whom? And so there, the divergence, I would say, between Power Five and even within Power Five to others is money driven, right? The finances are really what's creating that. When NIL became real, the governance or the infrastructure was not ready for that. And we all knew it wasn't ready. And I'll frame that just because the hardest part, and where most coaches had the biggest issues with the governing body, which was the NCAA of college football, was enforcement, and enforcement specifically to recruiting. There wasn't the staffing, there wasn't the oversight, and quite frankly, there weren't enough resources to manage the number of decisions, the number of teams not doing what they're supposed to do, and the accountability through enforcement staff and the legislation or the bureaucracy, I would say, to then end up coming to swift and certain accountability. And so coaches and programs are looking at how can they do that? And even though they might have been called on it, the process would take so long between then and anything that was done about it, that actually was kind of a promoting or giving this appearance that it's really not enforceable. So anyway, that was the existing backdrop prior to NIL. Okay, well, now let's add money to this. And so this immediate thought that the NIL is going to first and foremost benefit your current players, that's an amazing thought. And I am all for young people learning to manage their finances. It's back to and, right? Here's school, here's their family, here's their football team. And they can do this as well. It's hard enough to manage academics really well, to play football really well, to have a social life if they want one, and then now add another component. So if we can help them do that, well, that's what real life is. As you mentioned, you have young kids and there's stuff going on, right? So let's help them do that. But we all knew as coaches immediately that was going to shift to pay for play, meaning the predominant use of NIL was going to be in the attraction of players to a program, which then all of a sudden the collectives show up because, right, communities, they support their teams. And if they can get better players through finance, and it's supposed to be for hire, right, and be worthy of your hire, but we already knew the enforcement part and the recruiting was the weakest component to begin with. Let's add money to that now and then say, well, okay, now who's going to govern that? The NCAA reached out asking for help, right? Institutional help. Well, that's because the enforcement already wasn't capable. So I don't have any issue with NIL of current players. The issue that I have is the front end. And quite frankly, if you were to ask my colleagues, every recruiting meeting is starting with, as they bring up a player, who wants him and for how much, right? So, and that's not college football, in my opinion, or its original intent, which is framed against higher education. So that part needs management. I think what the athletic directors are saying is who does that, and could it go possibly into a subgroup? So could Power Five within the NCAA have its own governance structure and enforcement staff, and somehow it partners with each institution, and maybe someone's embedded in each institution, right, on site and on grounds and within the football office that's helping do that. And then maybe Group of Five has its own within the NCAA, because the variances are quite different. What the Group of Five has to deal with are then their players, when they perform well, being taken right through the transfer portal. And again, a lot of that's through third party, right? And third party contact is not legal. But the high school coaches are kind of now being, inserted into that role. So there's that dynamic. So the Group of Five coaches, their issue is keeping the good players they have. Power Five is having the finances through collectives to manage and to truly get players that want to come to their institution. But unfortunately, I'm not sure, Brian, and these are my own thoughts, when a young person is choosing a school now, certainly football has to be prevalent, and how good at that is that team going to be, and the coaches and their development. I'm wondering then where the money fits versus their education. And if you're saying, okay, which is getting more stock, I think right now, and this is a theory, that football is first. Maybe their finances are first. I don't know, right? It might be their finances are first, the football is second, and the education is third. A theory, right? And I open that up to people to consider what their thoughts are. I'm not saying for sure I'm right. It might be football's first, right? And then their NIL possibilities, and then their academics. At Virginia, I certainly would have hoped, man, the football and academics going together would have been up right there. And then my thoughts on NIL are quite different. The main issue back to governance that I have is the enforcement. So the NCAA is well equipped for so many things, and I think does a lot well, but the enforcement of the selection, assessment, and recruiting is not close. And the NIL component has made that worse. Back to an ideological standpoint, the thing that really bothers me most about NIL, as we're talking about the front end of players coming, I would say just the opposite. If we really, really care about these kids, what does the back end look like for NIL? So when these kids graduate, which I don't hear mentioned very much, when they get their master's degree, which I don't hear mentioned very much, then what is their network? What does their NIL look like then to launch into, right, life after an amazing college career, to then have in perpetuity just this amazing life? And I haven't heard hardly any emphasis on the back end. And so it's moved basically to this enticement of come to our school as the first and foremost reason for NIL. Secondly, help current players within your program. And lastly, is them on the way out. It would seem to me all that might be backwards in terms of maybe what would be best for young people. These kids that have helped our program so much, maybe we ought to be thinking about how they best ought to get launched into their future with the right infrastructure, right, and the best possibilities, then caring for, right, the players that are currently in our program, and then after that, the other way. And I know I just broke it into 3 categories. It all has to go on at the same time, but I think we might have it upside down. Back to this idea of lead one, I think they're just seeing the NCAA structure is capable in a lot of ways, but the flaws right now, to me, are the differences between division of college football, the specificity of issues, and then the enforcement of how do you manage now with the increased money and competition, which is already there, for schools that just simply aren't playing by the intent of the rules. And there are many. And that's unfortunate, but that's currently how it is. Can it be addressed? Certainly. Will it take time? Certainly. But again, it's higher education and the development of young people. And it appears like it's gone no, that's too strong a word. It's gone more to entertainment and finance as the primary drivers. And I would just like to see it all happen at the same time, just not so maybe one-sided.
Yeah, and a lot of the ADs kind of voted to essentially kind of remain within the NCAA structure, but kind of make those changes that you were alluding to make it more for the Power Five, make it more for kind of the Group of Five FCS. The Football Oversight Committee at the NCAA, they're responsible for everything from kind of running the FCS postseason tournament to certifying FBS bowl games. So like they have a lot on their plate, and I think being nimble is one of the big things that a lot of ADs and a lot of people in college athletics would like to see, and we're going to probably see that over the coming weeks and months. The Division I Transformation Committee is kind of looking at how Division I fits together, and a lot of focus maybe more on the basketball tournament and access to that, but that's also going to have a football component. So I'm sure a topic that we will continue to discuss not only in this podcast, but going forward in the industry. And you mentioned NIL. I do want to kind of dive into that a little bit. And I get that complaint from coaches all the time, just in terms of the lack of enforcement. And it's different too for a lot of coaches around the country, because you might be working in Ohio and have a state law there that could make things a lot more difficult than if you're working in Texas. And I sense that frustration amongst a lot of coaches, just in terms of dealing with things and not having that level playing field. I would imagine that is the kind of the overriding factor for a lot of folks, just saying let's at least be on the same page when it comes to NIL, right?
It is, and I think the same page is relevant. And again, that's my thought about specificity. And so the Pac-12, you'd certainly, if you're in the Pac-12, you would like it to be as level as possible within your own conference, certainly, right? The Big Ten, you would like it to be as level as possible within that. The SEC, the ACC, you would certainly want that. And so the state laws then, in some cases, make that more challenging, right? And that is very difficult. I think that's probably part of where some of the ideas of some of the money coming to conferences being distributed to the players, right? Let's say NIL went away. I'm just going to make something up. If NIL went away, but some of the television contracts went to the players on a percentage basis, right? Then it would be a level playing field, right? There would be, by playing, you get this amount. It's almost like the scholarship check, except here's this other part, right? That's way easier to enforce than the NIL and the collectives. And again, I'm not suggesting that. I'm trying to give an idea of that's what most coaches want. The difficulty within that is without another break. So the group of five and their resources versus the Power Five and their resources, and then quite frankly, television contracts within the Power Five. Each one of those is different right now. And so the coaches that are complaining, quite frankly, they're always going to be complaining unless it's in relation to their own league, right? Or then possibly a couple leagues combining that are level in playing field. The idea that this will ever be equal, when has it ever been? And when will it ever be? The closest to that is then with another subgroup breakoff of those schools that are generating X amount of dollars or are willing to spend this much in terms of budget. There is as close to level playing field as you're going to get, right? Financially. Those that fall short of that, they're the next tier. And there might be, 30 or 40 of those, then if level playing field is the idea, then that's, again, be careful of what you wish for, because that it might be, super five and then Power Five. And if there's access for all of those different tiers into the tournament, pretty fun. We see that in basketball, right? And we saw that with the Sun Belt and some of their upsets. So you compete like crazy with like-minded and like resource programs. And that's not to say that caliber of player and coach on the right day into the playoff couldn't then do something magical. And that's, I think that's kind of some of the idea of how our country was kind of formed, right? But the idea then, to your point of a level playing field, if you're talking about resources, I don't know how that happens without another tiering system, so to speak, or just quite frankly acknowledging the tiering and then doing everything you can within conferences for sure, then hopefully within level for sure to have it be equal. But that's going to be quite a challenge without maybe not another tier or two.
Yeah, I mean, I talked with Sun Belt Commissioner Keith Gill last week, just in terms of the Sun Belt and how they had the big Saturday last week.
Awesome. It was so fun.
He kind of mentioned, in a 12-team playoff world, how much enhanced that would be, because that could be for one of those spots in the playoffs. But just in terms of NIL, I guess we'll get you out of here with this.
Okay.
During this pause, as you have been kind of thinking about the future, and we alluded to it a little bit earlier, but as your kind of approach to NIL and how you would incorporate that inside your own program change a little bit as you look out across the landscape, and what your day-to-day process and your kind of overall philosophy, how you would incorporate NIL, has that changed these last couple of months?
It really has. Again, I love education. I love learning, and I love kids preparing for amazing careers that they can't wait to do, when football's over. I love that thought. And I wasn't sure, could that happen while they have NIL and going to school and playing and doing their social? Could all that really happen? And the answer is yes. And you and I do it all the time, right? Between our marriages, between our jobs, between any other social interests that we have, between philanthropy or giving back, between coaching Little League games, whatever it is, there's a lot going on. And so I was thinking, what great preparation for these kids to have a lot going on in college, and with the infrastructure and mentors to be helping them. What's become really clear to me is, as I alluded to, that's not going to be enough only from the college part. There's going to need to be, much like when you go into your profession or my profession, there are coaches that mentored me that had a huge influence once I was in my career and I graduated from college, and that education was ongoing. I love the idea of, again, thinking back to Virginia, some of the best and brightest minds on all the planet have graduated from UVA, and possibly their mentorship of those kids when they move on with their master's or their undergrad from UVA and they get to be tutored or mentored almost, again, in perpetuity of here's life, but because you went to UVA, you get access to, right, this is your support team that that's going to help you navigate the world, and we're united by this UVA education. And I started thinking about that. I got excited about just the lasting implications of then what college football can do on the back end. The front end, enforcement's driving everything, and I don't have great answers for that yet. But during, I love that idea of all the education and all the help we can give those kids to maximize that possibility while they have it. At the same time, education and school and football's going on. They're going to be tired, but so are we, right? That's just how what life is. But I'm captivated by that idea, but I'm captivated also of the then what. So whether it's pro career or not, what does that institution and what does their NIL-ish program look like upon launch into the real world? And I love the thought of considering those two things. And those are probably different or more ingrained thoughts than I had before I stepped back to just get a bigger perspective maybe 8 months ago.
Well, and we've kind of seen just that crossover, especially on the education front. Companies like Open Doors, Blake Lawrence, the CEO of them, the former Nebraska football player. You have others at Mogul, so a couple ex-college football quarterbacks running that operation. So, it definitely does kind of filter down. But so certainly as we kind of bump up here against the time limit that we discussed, I'm sure, we will have additional thoughts on NIL just because it is such a changing world over the next couple of weeks as we continue Head Coach U. But Bronco, thank you so much for joining me again. It was another wild week in college football and in the NFL. It was great to get your thoughts on all of that, as well as some of the kind of pressing topics that are facing the sport. We're going to explore that a little bit more next week as well. But for Bronco Mendenhall, I'm Bryan Fischer. Thanks for joining Head Coach U.
Thanks, everybody.